Today we're going to be creating a yeast starter. I highly recommend making a yeast starter whenever you brew, especially if you're going to do any high gravity beers. Yeast starters give you increased cell count, give you a nice high pitching rate, gives you nice healthy yeast cells that reach full attenuation and shorten the lag time before they take off. So good habit to get into, doesn't take a lot of time, and it gives you a little guarantee and insurance to know that your yeast is good before you brew. So I use a 2,000 milliliter flask. You can see I already have it filled up to 1,300 milliliters of water. I have my yeast. It's a good idea to, if you're going to use a smack pack like this, to smack it 6 to 8 hours ahead of time. I'm going to let mine get a little more fermented here before I actually pitch this. But we have some time to boil this water in the flask here and let it cool. I have my dry malt extract, which I'll be using for the yeast starter, and then just a container of some sanitizer, which I'm going to use for my flask topper. So that's really all you need to get started. So the first thing we're going to do is boil our flask. Before you boil in a flask, you do need to ensure that your flask does support direct heating. Okay, there are a lot of flasks out there that are not meant to be put directly on the stovetop, so please be sure that if you are going to direct boil your water in your flask, that your flask does support that. Okay, so here I am starting to boil my water in my flask. I'm going to stop just before it boils. I just want it to be hot when I add my DME because I don't want any boilovers. So I'm actually going to lower the heat a little bit here. And I have my DME ready to go. Typically, if you use a 1,000 milliliter flask, you would use 650 milliliters of water, and a 2,000 milliliter flask, you would use 1,300 milliliters of water. The DME that you use for a 1,000 milliliter flask with 650 milliliters of water, you would typically use a half cup for standard gravity beers and 3/4 cup for high gravity beers. For the larger 2,000 milliliter flask with 1,300 milliliters of water, you would use 1 cup of DME for standard gravity beers and 1.5 cups for high gravity beers. So now I know that my water is hot here. I'm just going to move my flask off the heat so that I can put my DME in there. You have to be very careful with boilovers. If your water is already boiling, you'd have a high chance of having a boilover. So not quite boiling, just have hot water. Slowly add the DME to make sure that you're not about to have a boilover. And after that, you want to swirl your flask to mix it all up. And again, you want to be careful. You don't want to do too much at once. It's kind of a few gentle shakes at first to get it mixed. And then after that, you can return it to your heat. And then gradually bring it to a slow rolling boil for about 15 minutes. Okay, you can see I have a nice rolling boil going on right now. You got to be very careful again about boilovers. It's really easy to boil over in a flask, so I'm just going to let this boil for 15 minutes. And after 15 minutes, we're going to cool this off in a bath of ice water. Okay, my 15-minute boil is complete. I put a foil top on top of my flask, and I prepared an ice water bath. So now you're going to take your flask and cool it down. I usually put the flask in the ice, spin it around a little bit, let it sit for a little bit, and then continue to spin it for a while. And that's it. Let your wort cool. So my wort is still cooling. I find that if I spin the wort around in the flask while it's in the ice water, it drastically reduces the amount of time to cool the wort. In the meantime, I have my yeast activator pack inside some sanitizer. So I filled some sanitizer here, and you want to sanitize not only the yeast pack but also the scissors that you will use to open up your package. Okay, once your yeast is cool, you want to remove the foil. You want to shake it up vigorously. It should be hard to do while I'm taping, but you want to aerate the wort. Boiling took all the oxygen out of the water, so you want to shake it up and get oxygen back in. Do that for a few minutes, and then you can go ahead and add your yeast. Okay, once your starter has cooled, you're going to take your yeast, and I've already opened my package again with sanitized scissors, and you simply pour it in. And put your stopper, your foam stopper in the top. And that's it. We're going to let the yeast settle, and we'll check back on it again tomorrow. Okay, it's been about 24 hours since we completed our yeast starter. And if you give your yeast just a little swirl, it's a good way of seeing the activity. You can see that it's all getting foamy and bubbly. And that's it. You've successfully completed making a yeast starter.